One of the best studies I had ever really done, especially early on in my Christian life, was Ephesians. Because I took the courses in seminary, especially beginning with Ephesians chapter 1, to get a handle on the doctrines of the faith most relative to the church. That's you and I, believers in Christ, and from the first century on. Ephesians chapter 1. Now I began to arrange my approach to get an accurate study of this book. It's only 6 chapters. So I said, well, I'm going to take my time and do it. And I established the rules of interpretation. They're not hard. Started learning them when I started going to elementary school. We first observe, and my seminary professor said, the most important thing you can do when studying the Bible is observe, observe, and observe. So the purpose of the observation stage is to maintain focus on the text at hand in accordance with the framework in which it was written. A framework which is defined by 3 things. All of them are normal. As you're growing up, you learn to study this book, or people spoke about it, and people spoke something special about it. Oh, you have to have special equipment and be equipped with special skills and so on and so forth. No, it's just normal. Normal rules of language. What does that mean? Well, how do you find out what words mean? In a dictionary. Well, your grandmother may have a few points of view on what words mean in and out of the Bible. But not everybody's your grandmother. So, and people are going to communicate commonly about it. It's not meant for a super class of people. A lot of denominations think that. Their denomination's right and wrong. The way to resolve problems, not with fisticuffs, like might almost happen to me day before yesterday, when I started to share my faith with a group of people that I thought were on the same side, and obviously they weren't. And their answer to my questions was fisticuffs. Told to physically leave the whole park. Anyway, normal rules of language. Dictionaries, Funkin' Wagonal. Ever heard of Webster's Collegiate Dictionary? That's a good one. And context. Well, you have grammar books too, We get grammar books. Go to a 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, go all the way on up. Learn to read. More and more and more. Now, the Bible's got a lot of vocabulary to it. So there's something more. When you start reading, that's the first thing that you do. Build up a list and memorize a group of vocabulary words. Now we've got those down pat. Let's move on to context. Who, what, why, where, when, and to whom. Right? So if something is directed by the author, and it should be plain, especially in a book like the Bible. So if it's in the Old Testament, which are just the Hebrew books, largely directed once Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob came along, talking about Genesis 15 or so, or Genesis 12, actually, Abraham, 12, 13, 14, 15, and we have Isaac and Jacob, and their history going into Israel, into Egypt when the famine occurred, and then staying there 150 more years. They were in the promised land before that. And the famine comes, and so they're spending time in Egypt. And then they ended up, as circumstance the history shows, in captivity, and they had to escape and become God's chosen people. God showing himself who he is by providing for their escape, miraculous one, and the destruction of Egypt thereafter. Egypt was not far less than what it was before. And history books show that. And logic. If A equals B, B equals C, A equals C. right? And all kinds of logical things. One thing you don't logically do is cherry pick a verse here and present it to something over there where it's not talking about the same scenario or people. That may be true, but it's not up to you. Let the author determine his point of view on the particular matter. Don't invent it. Don't rewrite it. You can critique it all you want, but critique what the writer wrote, not what you think it says. So, language, context, and logic, rules which do not impose undue, unintended meanings to the text. Proper approach to Scripture. Just take a look at this, a sketch at this. The Bible is to be interpreted by the normative rules of language, context, and logic. Upon examination, careful examination of the Bible, it becomes evident that the authors who wrote every word exclusively utilized the normative rules of language, context, and logic. In the absence of evidence anywhere in the Bible or elsewhere that it is to be interpreted with a standard set of rules outside of what man, to whom the Bible is written, would normally expect. You say, gee, I'm just an average Joe. What rules do I interpret this by? No, you just pick it up and read it, by what you learned in school. And in view of the evidence that a strict adherence to the normative rules of language, context, and logic produces what? The most trustworthy, non-contradictory, immutable, consistent interpretation. You're testing it out. Let's just read and see what it says. If it doesn't make any sense, if it's nonsense, we'll move on to the second thing, the third thing. I learned that about all of the other religious books. They have difficulties maintaining a consistent approach and a consistent determination of what the teachings should be. 1 minute it's one way, 1 minute it's the other. We must thereupon follow the writer's plan of how to interpret the work of the Bible by the simple rules of reading. And doesn't that make sense? You get to the age of accountability, you have some reading skills, you can read the thing. Now, a lot of times I do ask and I consult with commentaries because they've studied the history. But most of the time, you will get commentaries that provide better insights, give you a quicker understanding. But that doesn't mean you won't get the understanding. And these insightful commentaries, I like Bible Knowledge Commentary, Dallas Seminary, Expositor's Bible Commentary. And I like those two. The latter one goes into far more detail, provides alternative meanings which may or may not be feasible, and it lets you determine for yourself. But it still goes by the normative rules of language, context, and logic. And you have other people you can ask as you go through your Christian walk and find God sends people to you who are of an expertise that can help you study. So be all ears. And don't be consigned to one group of people or one pastor, unless he's a good pastor and becomes your pastor-teacher. After years and years of searching, I finally found Pastor John Danish of Berean Memorial Church, Irving, Texas, back in my time. And I spent a lot of time up in the tape room because he'd been there for decades. And the man was so considerate, he recorded his recordings. And they were academic recordings. They weren't supposed to be inspirational and then academic. They were academic, which would inspire. Because academic means you're observing and reporting according to the rules of language, context, and logic. And you recognize how inspirational this is because this is showing you, by your normal reading skills, how you can attain what God is speaking to you through this printed word. So, upon careful examination of the Bible, it becomes evident that the authors who wrote every word exclusively utilized the normative rules of language, context, and logic in the absence of evidence anywhere in the Bible or elsewhere that it is to be interpreted with a specialized set of rules, letting people say that, outside of what man to whom the Bible was written would normally expect. And in view of the evidence that a strict adherence to the normative rules of language, context, and logic produces the most trustworthy, non-contradictory, immutable, consistent interpretation, we must thereupon follow the writer's plan of how to interpret their work of the Bible. And that's amazing, because some of these intricacies I finally get into, after all these years, decades, over 35,000 pages, and answering some of the skeptics' points of view or their interpretations, and I wanted to check them out. This normative rules of language, context, and logic has no flaws. Well, we can prove out by normatively reading it. In order for an individual to properly build an interpretation of the Bible, he needs to determine the meaning of one verse at a time. That's normative. You pick what? Which verse do you pick? Well, you have to pick a book, and you have to pick chapter 1, and you have to pick the first word in chapter 1, in the first verse. Rocket science? No. Convenient. Ready for you to open up and benefit by a simple reading. Take your time. So, in order for an individual to properly build an interpretation of the Bible, he needs to determine the meaning of one verse at a time in the passage it was written in the order that it was written, by determining the proper context of that passage via the proper application of the normative rules of language, context, and logic to that passage. Hence, he does not have to be the author or an editor, nor does he have to be a scholar, nor is there someone special, a pastor or a teacher, through whom he must go in order to determine what the Bible is saying. I've talked to a number of atheists. They follow that rule and they get what it means. And they affirm back to me. And most of them are very scholarly, because they've had to defend atheism far more than I've had to defend Christianity. But I find I can follow them and refute them, but they get the meaning. They just don't want to believe it. Some meanings they don't get because they don't want to believe the meaning that leads up to it. So I don't believe that, so I'm not going to listen to the next thing. So they don't bother to read it properly. In essence, this is simply a matter of applying one's own reading skills in a proficient, honest, and objective manner. So in essence, as I said, this is simply a matter of applying one's own reading skills in a proficient, honest, and objective manner. If you have less or more reading skills, less or more intellect, less or more intellectual energy, or whatever, time, it'll take you a little longer, a little less. But the decisions, the understanding, the observations are there to be had. And God will provide people you can ask questions to, because sometimes your historical background will be lacking. Sometimes you'll have it. A lot of times you don't have to know a whole lot. I had one guy tell me you have to know the whole history of Israel in order to read the Old Testament. Nonsense. You have to have his familiarity with the culture of Israel. Nonsense. Or speak the language. Nonsense. You got some very good English translations. So just pick one. On the other hand, it takes time and self-discipline to properly dig into the text, including making repeated efforts to check every conclusion one makes, especially those conclusions that others insist the Bible teaches and are not right. Most people, especially pastors and teachers, read into a text by going elsewhere into the Bible, or by adding personal thoughts and conclusions that the text at hand does not warrant. When a pastor goes and explains the passage, and it seems pretty good, they said, now let's apply this to each one of you individuals. Get up and leave. It's none of his business. And how does he know you to apply it to you? You apply it to yourself. Instead of working hard and long to limit oneself to only what the text is saying by the normative rules and language, context, and logic, most people, especially pastors and teachers, read into a text by going elsewhere in the Bible or by adding personal thoughts and conclusions that the text at hand does not warrant. So you got to limit yourself to only what the text is saying by the normative rules. That's why we have so many differing points of view about the Bible.